The story of the American Revolution does not begin with gunfire, declarations, or independence. It begins in the aftermath of a global war, with an empire victorious, exhausted, and deeply uncertain about how to govern the vast territories it had just secured. In 1763, the British Empire stood at the height of its power. The 7 Years' War had ended in triumph over France, leaving Britain dominant in North America. Yet that victory carried immense cost. Britain emerged burdened by debt, responsible for defending enormous new lands, and increasingly determined to bring its American colonies under tighter control. For the colonists, the same year marked a turning point from relative autonomy to growing imperial pressure. What followed over the next quarter-century was not an inevitable march toward independence, but a long, contested struggle over power, identity, and the meaning of liberty. For more than a century before the Revolution, Britain's North American colonies had existed in a state often described as benign neglect. Imperial laws existed, but enforcement was uneven. Colonial assemblies exercised real authority over taxation and local governance. Merchants traded widely, sometimes illegally, and colonial societies developed their own political cultures, economies, and expectations. Colonists were proud to be British. They celebrated British victories, read British newspapers, and claimed the rights of Englishmen as their inheritance. Loyalty to the crown was widespread and sincere. The end of the 7 Years' War changed the calculus. Britain now faced the task of defending a long frontier against Native American resistance and potential European rivals. Maintaining troops in North America was expensive, and British leaders believed it was reasonable for colonists to share the burden. From London's perspective, new taxes and regulations were not oppression, but reform, an effort to make the empire more efficient and equitable. From the colony's perspective, however, these measures threatened established rights and traditions. The first major flashpoint came with the Proclamation of 1763. Issued to stabilize relations with Native American nations after a wave of frontier violence, it restricted colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. To imperial officials, this boundary was a pragmatic solution. To many colonists, especially land speculators and settlers, it felt like a betrayal. They had fought in the recent war and now found themselves barred from lands they believed they had earned. The proclamation signaled a new imperial willingness to interfere directly in colonial affairs. Economic measures soon followed. The Sugar Act of 1764 lowered the tax on molasses but strengthened enforcement, aiming to raise revenue rather than merely regulate trade. Colonial merchants, accustomed to smuggling with little consequence, suddenly faced seizures and vice-admiralty courts without juries. Protests emerged, not yet revolutionary in tone, but rooted in a familiar argument. Parliament was violating traditional rights by imposing taxes without colonial consent. The crisis deepened with the Stamp Act of 1765. For the first time, Parliament imposed a direct internal tax on the colonies, requiring printed materials to carry a government stamp. Newspapers, legal documents, pamphlets, and even playing cards were affected. The tax itself was modest, but its implications were profound. Colonists argued that only their own elected assemblies had the authority to tax them. The slogan, "No taxation without representation," captured this belief, though its meaning was complex. Some colonists demanded actual representation in Parliament. Others argued that representation was impossible across an ocean and that Parliament therefore had no taxing authority at all in the colonies. Resistance to the Stamp Act was widespread and intense. Colonial assemblies passed resolutions asserting their rights. Merchants organized boycotts of British goods. Crowds gathered in the streets, sometimes violently, targeting stamp distributors and royal officials. Groups like the Sons of Liberty emerged, blending protest, intimidation, and political organization. The Stamp Act Congress convened in New York, bringing together delegates from multiple colonies to issue a unified protest. This intercolonial cooperation was unprecedented and would prove significant. Under pressure from British merchants hurt by the boycotts, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766. Celebration swept the colonies, but the victory was incomplete. At the same time, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, asserting its authority to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The constitutional question remained unresolved. Colonists believed they had defended their rights. Parliament believed it had reaffirmed its sovereignty. The uneasy peace did not last. In 1767, new duties known as the Townshend Acts placed taxes on imported goods such as glass, lead, paper, paint, and tea. Revenue from these duties was used to pay royal governors and judges, weakening colonial assemblies' leverage over officials. Once again, colonists responded with protests and boycotts. Political writings flourished, warning that liberty was under threat and that corruption in Britain threatened the freedom of all Englishmen. Boston became a center of resistance and repression. British troops were stationed in the city to enforce order, inflaming tensions between soldiers and civilians. On a cold night in March 1770, those tensions erupted. A confrontation between townspeople and soldiers ended with gunfire and the deaths of 5 colonists. The incident, soon labeled the Boston Massacre, was seized upon by Patriot leaders as evidence of British tyranny. Though the soldiers were later acquitted in a trial that demonstrated the colonists' commitment to legal principles, the symbolic damage was done. That same year, Parliament repealed most of the Townshend duties, leaving only the tax on tea. Once again, many colonists believed the crisis had passed. Trade resumed. Protests subsided. Yet beneath the surface, mistrust lingered. Patriot leaders remained vigilant, convinced that Britain's retreat was temporary and that liberty required constant defense. The next major confrontation arose not from taxation alone, but from questions of authority and obedience. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, designed to rescue the financially troubled East India Company by allowing it to sell tea directly to the colonies at a reduced price. The tea was cheaper than smuggled alternatives, but it still carried the symbolic tax. Accepting it would acknowledge Parliament's right to tax. Patriot leaders framed the issue as a test of principle rather than price. In Boston, resistance took dramatic form. On a December night, men disguised as Native Americans boarded ships in the harbor and dumped hundreds of chests of tea into the water. The Boston Tea Party was both a protest and a provocation, challenging imperial authority openly and defiantly. To British leaders, it was an act of vandalism that demanded punishment. Parliament responded with a series of measures intended to restore order and assert control. Known in the colonies as the Coercive Acts, these laws closed Boston Harbor until the tea was paid for, altered the Massachusetts Charter to reduce self-government, allowed royal officials accused of crimes to be tried elsewhere, and expanded the quartering of troops. Rather than isolating Massachusetts, these acts united the colonies in sympathy and alarm. If Parliament could strip one colony of its rights, none were safe. In response, colonial leaders called for a Continental Congress. In 1774, delegates from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia. They did not yet seek independence. Instead, they issued declarations of rights, protested the coercive acts, and called for renewed boycotts. They also agreed to meet again if their grievances were not addressed. The First Continental Congress marked a critical step toward unity, but it also revealed deep divisions. Some delegates hoped for reconciliation. Others believed conflict was inevitable. As 1775 began, the situation grew increasingly volatile. In Massachusetts, colonial militias trained and stockpiled weapons. British officials prepared to assert authority by force if necessary. In April, British troops marched toward the towns of Lexington and Concord to seize military supplies. Colonial militias mobilized in response. Shots were fired. Men fell. The war had begun, though few yet understood its full implications. The early fighting shocked both sides. Colonial forces were not a unified army, but a collection of militias, motivated by local loyalty and a sense of defending their communities. British forces were professional soldiers, confident in their discipline and experience. Yet the resistance was stronger and more determined than British leaders had anticipated. The siege of Boston followed, and in June, colonial forces clashed with British troops on the heights overlooking the city. Though the British technically won the battle, their heavy casualties stunned observers and emboldened the colonial cause. Even as fighting spread, many colonists still clung to hopes of reconciliation. In July 1775, the Continental Congress sent a final petition to the king, affirming loyalty and asking for redress of grievances. The petition was rejected. Instead, Britain declared the colonies in rebellion. The lines were drawn. What had begun as protests within an empire was becoming a struggle over sovereignty itself. This is where the revolution entered a new phase. Ideas that had once been abstract now took on urgent meaning. Questions about rights, representation, power, and authority could no longer be postponed. The conflict would not only determine who ruled the colonies, but what kind of society would emerge from the struggle. The shift from protest to revolution was not sudden, but it was decisive. As armed conflict spread in 1775, colonists were forced to confront a question they had long avoided. If Parliament and the Crown were willing to use force to compel obedience, what did loyalty mean, and what alternatives remained? For many, independence was still unthinkable. Britain was the most powerful empire in the world. Separation carried enormous risks. Yet the logic of events pushed the colonies toward conclusions that once seemed radical. One of the most important developments of this period was the transformation of political thought. Colonial resistance had always relied on ideas drawn from British tradition, especially the belief that liberty depended on limiting power. Writers warned that corruption, standing armies, and unchecked authority led inevitably to tyranny. These arguments became more urgent as the war escalated. Political pamphlets circulated widely, read aloud in taverns, churches, and private homes. They did not merely describe events, they shaped how people understood them. Among the most influential of these works was a pamphlet published in early 1776 that directly challenged the legitimacy of monarchy itself. Written in clear, forceful language, it argued that hereditary rule was irrational and dangerous, and that the colonies had no obligation to remain tied to a distant island that dragged them into wars and restricted their growth. The pamphlet framed independence not as a reckless gamble, but as common sense. Its impact was profound. It reached audiences far beyond the educated elite and helped shift public opinion toward acceptance of separation. Meanwhile, the Continental Congress took steps that made independence increasingly likely. It authorized the creation of a continental army and appointed a commander to lead it. This decision reflected both pragmatism and symbolism. A unified military force suggested a unified political purpose. Yet the army faced enormous challenges from the start. It lacked training, supplies, and reliable funding. Soldiers enlisted for short terms, and desertion was common. Keeping the army intact would prove as difficult as defeating the enemy. The first major test of the war came in the summer of 1776. British forces launched a massive campaign to crush the rebellion by capturing New York, a strategically vital port. The scale of the British effort was overwhelming. Thousands of troops, supported by a powerful navy, landed and engaged the Continental Army in a series of battles. The colonial forces suffered defeat after defeat and were forced to retreat across New Jersey. At times, the revolutionary cause seemed on the verge of collapse. Yet survival itself became a form of victory. The army avoided destruction, preserving the core of resistance. In the winter that followed, morale was low, enlistments were expiring, and public support wavered. In this bleak moment, a daring gamble helped revive the cause. A surprise attack on enemy forces during the holiday season resulted in a much-needed victory. Though small in scale, it had an outsized psychological impact. It demonstrated that the British were not invincible and that perseverance could yield results. While battles raged, the political break with Britain became official. In July 1776, the Continental Congress adopted a declaration announcing that the colonies were now free and independent states. The document was both a justification and a proclamation. It accused the king of violating the rights of the colonists and asserted that governments derived their legitimacy from the consent of the governed. Though rooted in earlier traditions, its language was bold and universal, proclaiming that all men were endowed with natural rights. The declaration did not create unity overnight. Large numbers of colonists remained loyal to Britain or sought to avoid taking sides. Families and communities were divided. Loyalists faced harassment, confiscation of property, and sometimes violence. Patriots debated how far revolutionary principles should go and who should be included in the new political order. Independence clarified the stakes, but it also intensified internal conflict. As the war continued, Britain adjusted its strategy. Unable to quickly suppress the rebellion in the northern colonies, British leaders turned their attention south, believing they could rally loyalist support in regions with different economic and social structures. Early successes suggested the plan might work. Major southern cities fell under British control and loyalist forces mobilized. But the strategy underestimated the depth of resistance and overestimated loyalist strength. The southern campaign became brutal and chaotic. Fighting took on the character of civil war, with neighbors and even relatives on opposing sides. Guerrilla warfare, reprisals, and shifting allegiances made the conflict unpredictable and violent. Control of territory changed hands repeatedly, draining British resources and eroding their ability to impose lasting authority. One of the most critical developments of the war was the involvement of foreign powers. From the beginning, colonial leaders understood that defeating Britain alone would be extremely difficult. They sought allies, particularly among Britain's European rivals. Early victories helped convince foreign courts that the rebellion had potential. Diplomatic efforts focused on securing recognition, military aid, and financial support. France played the decisive role. Motivated by its rivalry with Britain and the desire to avenge earlier defeats, it entered the war openly on the side of the American states. French involvement transformed the conflict from a colonial rebellion into a global war. French troops, ships, and resources bolstered the American effort, while fighting spread to Europe, the Caribbean, and beyond. Spain and the Netherlands also became involved, further stretching British power. The presence of foreign allies altered the balance of the war. Naval power, in particular, became crucial. Control of the seas affected supply lines, troop movements, and the outcome of major campaigns. The British Navy, long a symbol of imperial strength, now faced serious challenges. The turning point of the war came after years of stalemate and hardship. A British army operating in the southern colonies found itself trapped by American and Allied forces. Cut off from escape and resupply, it was forced to surrender. The defeat was devastating for British morale and political support for the war. Though fighting continued in some areas, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Negotiations to end the conflict took time, complicated by competing interests and lingering hostilities. Ultimately, Britain recognized the independence of the former colonies in a treaty that formally ended the war. The American Revolution had succeeded, but victory brought new challenges. The task of creating a stable and lasting political system remained. Independence did not resolve all questions of power and liberty. The former colonies now had to govern themselves, reconcile revolutionary ideals with practical realities, and determine how much authority to grant to a central government. During the war, they had operated under a loose confederation, prioritizing autonomy and mistrusting centralized power. That system proved fragile. Economic difficulties, disputes among states, and internal unrest exposed the weaknesses of the existing political arrangement. Without the unifying pressure of war, differences resurfaced. Leaders who had once focused on resisting imperial authority now had to confront the dangers of disunion and instability. The revolution, in this sense, did not end with independence. It entered a new phase, one in which the struggle shifted from fighting an empire to building a nation. The ideals that had justified rebellion would now be tested by governance. The years following independence were marked by uncertainty, experimentation, and anxiety. Victory had secured freedom from British rule, but it had not provided a clear blueprint for what the new nation should become. The former colonies, now states, guarded their sovereignty fiercely. Their shared experience of resisting centralized authority made them wary of replacing one distant power with another closer to home. As a result, the political structure that emerged during the war was intentionally weak. The framework that governed the new nation rested on a compact among the states that emphasized cooperation rather than command. The central government lacked the power to tax, regulate commerce effectively, or enforce its decisions. It depended on voluntary contributions from the states, which were often late or insufficient. This arrangement reflected revolutionary fears of tyranny, but it also created practical problems that became increasingly difficult to ignore. Economic challenges loomed large. The war had left the nation deeply in debt, both to foreign allies and to its own citizens. Currency issued during the conflict had depreciated sharply, eroding trust in paper money. Trade patterns were disrupted, and British markets were no longer open on favorable terms. States pursued their own economic policies, sometimes imposing tariffs on each other, undermining the sense of national unity. Social tensions also intensified. Many Americans had expected that independence would bring greater equality and opportunity. While some changes occurred, particularly the weakening of aristocratic titles and inherited privilege, inequalities persisted. Veterans returned home to find themselves unpaid or underpaid. Farmers struggled with debt and taxes imposed by state governments desperate for revenue. In some regions, resentment turned into open resistance. One such uprising revealed the fragility of the post-war order. When farmers protested against high taxes and debt enforcement, state authorities struggled to respond. The central government lacked the resources to assist. To many observers, the episode was alarming. It suggested that the ideals of the revolution might dissolve into chaos if a stronger political structure was not created. At the same time, debates over the meaning of liberty continued. Revolutionary rhetoric had emphasized natural rights and the consent of the governed, but applying these principles proved complex. Questions about who counted as part of the political community became increasingly urgent. Property requirements limited voting rights in many states. Women, who had contributed significantly to the war effort and to sustaining households, remained excluded from formal political power. Enslaved people faced a stark contradiction between revolutionary ideals and continued bondage. The revolution did, however, inspire significant challenges to slavery, particularly in the northern states. Gradual emancipation laws began to appear, reflecting a growing recognition that slavery was incompatible with the principles proclaimed during the struggle for independence. In the southern states, where slavery was deeply embedded in the economy, the institution remained intact, setting the stage for future conflict. Native American nations faced devastating consequences in the revolution's aftermath. Many had allied with Britain, believing it offered the best chance to limit colonial expansion. With British defeat, those protections vanished. American settlers pushed westward, claiming lands and displacing indigenous peoples. The new nation inherited the imperial mindset of expansion, even as it rejected imperial rule. Foreign relations posed another challenge. Independence required not only self-governance, but also recognition and respect on the global stage. The young nation had to navigate a world dominated by powerful empires, balancing alliances and asserting its sovereignty. Weakness at home undermined credibility abroad. These pressures led many leaders to conclude that reform was necessary. Calls for revising the existing political framework grew louder. Initially, the goal was modest: to strengthen the central government enough to manage commerce, finance, and defense without undermining state autonomy. Yet as discussions progressed, it became clear that piecemeal adjustments would not suffice. A gathering was convened with the stated purpose of revising the existing system. What emerged instead was a bold proposal to create an entirely new framework of government. Delegates brought with them diverse perspectives shaped by regional interests, economic concerns, and philosophical beliefs. Some feared centralized power above all else. Others believed that liberty could not survive without order and effective governance. The debates were intense and often contentious. Fundamental questions were at stake. How should power be divided between national and state governments? How should representation be structured in a society marked by vast differences in population and wealth? How could the new system prevent tyranny while remaining capable of decisive action? Compromise became the essential tool of progress. Large states and small states reached agreements that balanced population-based representation with equal state representation. Slavery, the most morally fraught issue, was addressed through arrangements that postponed confrontation rather than resolving it. These compromises reflected both pragmatism and moral failure, binding the nation together while embedding deep contradictions. The resulting framework created a system of separated powers, checks and balances, and a strong but limited central authority. It sought to channel human ambition toward the preservation of liberty rather than its destruction. Power was divided not only between branches of government, but also between levels, creating a complex structure designed to prevent concentration of authority. The proposal faced immediate resistance. Many Americans feared that the new system betrayed the revolution by recreating distant, unaccountable power. The debate over ratification became one of the most intense political struggles in the nation's early history. Supporters argued that the framework was necessary to preserve the gains of independence. Opponents warned that it endangered individual liberties and state sovereignty. Public discussion flourished. Essays, speeches, and pamphlets debated the merits and dangers of the proposed system. This period demonstrated a remarkable commitment to reasoned argument and civic engagement. Ultimately, supporters prevailed, often by promising that amendments would be added to protect individual rights. With ratification complete, the new government began its work. Establishing legitimacy required careful balance. Early leaders sought to demonstrate that the system could govern effectively without replicating the abuses of imperial rule. Institutions were built, precedents established, and authority cautiously exercised. The American Revolution thus culminated not in a single moment of triumph, but in an ongoing process of negotiation between ideals and realities. Independence had created the possibility of a new kind of political order. Whether it would fulfill its promise remained an open question. The creation of the new political system did not erase the legacy of the revolution. Instead, it institutionalized the conflict between competing visions of liberty that had existed from the beginning. Some Americans believed freedom meant protection from concentrated power, minimal government, and strong local control. Others believed liberty required an energetic national authority capable of defending the nation, regulating the economy, and maintaining order. These tensions did not disappear with independence. They became permanent features of American political life. The early years of the new government revealed both the strengths and fragilities of the revolutionary settlement. Establishing financial stability was a pressing concern. The national debt threatened the nation's credibility, while disagreements over economic policy reflected deeper divisions between regions and social groups. Policies designed to stabilize credit and encourage commerce were praised by some as necessary for national survival and condemned by others as betrayals of republican simplicity. Foreign affairs tested the revolution's promise of sovereignty. The new nation found itself caught between rival European powers still locked in conflict. Maintaining independence required careful diplomacy and, at times, unpopular compromises. Debates over alliances and neutrality exposed lingering fears of foreign influence and internal subversion. The revolution had freed the nation from one empire, but it had not removed it from a world shaped by imperial rivalry. At the same time, Americans continued to grapple with the revolution's moral implications. The language of natural rights and equality had inspired hopes for broader social transformation. In some cases, those hopes led to concrete change. Religious freedom expanded as state-supported churches declined. Legal reforms reduced harsh punishments and emphasized rehabilitation. Education gained renewed importance as a foundation for Republican citizenship. Yet many promises remained unfulfilled. Slavery persisted, protected by law and economic interest. The gap between revolutionary ideals and lived reality grew increasingly difficult to ignore. Some Americans recognized this contradiction early, warning that a nation founded on liberty could not endure while denying freedom to so many. Others avoided the issue, prioritizing unity and stability over justice. The decision to postpone resolution would shape the nation's future in profound ways. The revolution also transformed American identity. Before the conflict, colonists had thought of themselves primarily as Virginians, New Yorkers, or Pennsylvanians, and secondarily as British subjects. The struggle against Britain fostered a new sense of collective belonging. This identity was fragile and contested, but it was real. Shared sacrifice, shared rhetoric, and shared institutions helped bind the states together, even as differences persisted. Memory played a crucial role in shaping this identity. Stories of the revolution emphasized unity, virtue, and heroism, often smoothing over internal conflict and division. Loyalists largely disappeared from the national narrative, their experiences marginalized or forgotten. The revolution was remembered as a righteous struggle against tyranny, reinforcing a belief in America's moral exceptionalism. This belief had consequences. It encouraged confidence in the nation's destiny and justified expansion beyond its original borders. The same revolutionary language that had challenged imperial authority was now used to defend the spread of American power across the continent. Indigenous peoples, once courted as allies or obstacles by European empires, faced a new and relentless force. The revolution had ended colonial rule, but it had not ended colonialism. International observers watched the American experiment closely. Some saw it as proof that Republican government could succeed on a large scale. Others predicted failure, believing that internal divisions and lack of tradition would lead to collapse. The early survival of the new system inspired reformers abroad and alarmed monarchs who feared the spread of revolutionary ideas. The American Revolution, viewed in this broader context, was both radical and conservative. It challenged inherited authority and asserted the right of people to govern themselves. At the same time, it preserved many existing hierarchies and limited participation in the political process. Its leaders were not seeking social revolution in the modern sense, but rather the preservation of liberty as they understood it. This complexity is essential to understanding the revolution's significance. It was not a simple story of oppressed people rising up against tyranny, nor was it merely a dispute over taxes. It was a struggle over who should wield power, how it should be constrained, and what obligations rulers owed to the governed. Those questions did not vanish with victory. They became embedded in the nation's institutions and debates. By the end of the 1780s, the transformation was unmistakable. 13 colonies had become a sovereign nation with a written framework of government unlike any that had existed before. Authority flowed from the people rather than a monarch. Law was grounded in consent rather than tradition alone. These changes marked a profound break with the past. Yet the revolution's ultimate meaning would be shaped not only by what was written and declared, but by how those principles were applied over time. The experiment begun in rebellion would continue through argument, reform, and conflict. The legacy of the American Revolution was not a finished achievement, but an ongoing challenge. The revolution's influence extended far beyond the borders of the new nation, reshaping how people around the world thought about authority, rights, and the legitimacy of power. News of the American struggle circulated widely, carried by pamphlets, diplomats, and travelers. To many observers, it represented a daring challenge to the assumption that monarchy and empire were natural and permanent features of human society. The idea that ordinary people could overthrow imperial rule and construct a government based on written principles captured imaginations across continents. Within the United States, however, the lived reality of independence was often less dramatic than the rhetoric suggested. Daily life resumed its rhythms of work, trade, and community, even as political debates continued. The revolution had been disruptive, but it had not erased existing social structures overnight. Wealth remained unevenly distributed. Political power remained concentrated among those with property and influence. The gap between revolutionary language and social reality persisted, shaping both hope and disillusionment. One of the most enduring outcomes of the revolution was the normalization of political participation. While suffrage was limited, public engagement in political discussion expanded dramatically. Newspapers multiplied, spreading news and opinion to a broader audience than ever before. Ordinary citizens became accustomed to debating policies, criticizing leaders, and viewing government as a human creation rather than a divine inheritance. This cultural shift was as important as any formal institution. The military legacy of the revolution also left a deep imprint. Suspicion of standing armies remained strong, rooted in the belief that professional forces threatened liberty. At the same time, the war demonstrated the necessity of organized defense. Balancing these concerns shaped early policies and reflected the revolution's broader tension between fear of power and need for order. Veterans carried the memory of the conflict into civilian life. Their experiences became sources of prestige, political capital, and collective identity. Yet many also carried physical wounds, psychological trauma, and economic hardship. The nation struggled to honor their service while managing limited resources. These challenges underscored the cost of independence and the limits of revolutionary idealism. Religion, too, was transformed by the revolution. While faith remained central to many communities, the close ties between church and state weakened. The principle of religious liberty gained ground, reflecting the broader revolutionary emphasis on freedom of conscience. This shift did not eliminate religious influence, but it changed its relationship to political authority, reinforcing the idea that belief should be a matter of choice rather than coercion. The revolution reshaped relationships between generations. Younger Americans who came of age during or after the war inherited a society defined by self-rule rather than imperial dependency. They took independence for granted, even as older generations remembered the uncertainty and fear that had accompanied the break with Britain. This generational divide influenced political priorities and interpretations of revolutionary meaning. Economic life gradually adjusted to independence. New markets emerged, old ones were renegotiated, and domestic production expanded. These changes were uneven and often painful, but they contributed to a growing sense of economic autonomy. Independence was not only a political condition, but an economic aspiration, one that would continue to shape national policy debates. The revolution's contradictions remained unresolved. The coexistence of liberty and slavery, expansion and dispossession, equality and exclusion posed challenges that could not be indefinitely postponed. Some Americans recognized these tensions and sought reform. Others resisted change, fearing that further transformation would undermine stability. The revolution thus became a reference point for competing visions of the nation's future, invoked by reformers and conservatives alike. Over time, the revolution itself became an object of reverence. Its leaders were elevated to near-mythic status, its events commemorated in rituals and symbols. This process of memory-making helped unify the nation, but also simplified a complex past. The messy realities of dissent, failure, and compromise were often overshadowed by narratives of inevitable progress and moral clarity. Understanding the American Revolution requires holding these tensions in view. It was an extraordinary assertion of self-determination that reshaped global politics. It was also a limited transformation that left many hierarchies intact. Its success lay not in creating a perfect society, but in establishing a framework that allowed for continued debate, adaptation, and reform. From protest to empire, the revolution traced a path that mirrored the paradox at its heart. It began as a defense of traditional rights within an empire and ended with the creation of a new state that would, in time, wield power on a continental scale. The struggle against imperial authority gave birth to a nation that would confront its own imperial ambitions. The years from 1763 to 1789 thus mark more than a rebellion against British rule. They represent a profound rethinking of political legitimacy and human agency. The revolution asked whether people could govern themselves, whether power could be constrained by law, and whether liberty could be preserved without descending into chaos. The answers were provisional, contested, and incomplete, but they reshaped history. The American Revolution did not conclude with a final victory or a definitive settlement. It became a living inheritance, shaping institutions, debates, and identities long after the last shots were fired. Its legacy lies not only in independence achieved, but in the enduring struggle to define what that independence means. As the 18th century drew to a close, Americans increasingly understood that the revolution had altered not only their political status, but their relationship to power itself. Under British rule, authority had been distant and largely unquestioned in daily life. After independence, power was closer, more visible, and more contested. Government was no longer an abstract presence across the ocean. It was composed of neighbors, elected officials, courts, and laws that directly affected communities. This proximity made political conflict both more immediate and more personal. The habits of resistance developed during the revolutionary years did not disappear with independence. Americans had learned to petition, protest, boycott, and organize. These tools, once aimed at imperial officials, were now turned inward. Citizens challenged state governments, criticized national policies, and mobilized around competing visions of the public good. This persistent engagement was both a strength and a source of instability. It kept authority accountable, but also threatened cohesion. One of the revolution's most enduring contributions was the belief that legitimacy required justification. Rulers could no longer rely on tradition or force alone. Policies had to be explained, defended, and aligned with shared principles. This expectation shaped political culture deeply. Even unpopular decisions were framed in the language of rights, necessity, and the common good. The revolution had created a political vocabulary that constrained power even as it enabled it. The experience of fighting a global empire also left Americans with a heightened awareness of international forces. Independence did not mean isolation. Trade, diplomacy, and security tied the nation to a wider world. Decisions made abroad could still shape domestic fortunes. This awareness fostered both caution and ambition. Americans sought to avoid entanglements that might threaten their autonomy, even as they pursued opportunities that promised growth and influence. The new political system established in the wake of independence embodied these lessons. Its structure reflected deep skepticism about concentrated authority. Power was fragmented, slowed, and balanced. This design was not an accident or a purely theoretical exercise. It was the product of lived experience under imperial rule and revolutionary struggle. The system assumed that conflict was inevitable and sought to manage it rather than eliminate it. Yet no system could fully resolve the contradictions inherited from the revolution. Expansion westward accelerated, driven by population growth and economic opportunity. This expansion was often justified using revolutionary language about liberty and progress, even as it displaced indigenous peoples and extended systems of exploitation. The ideals that had once challenged empire were now adapted to serve national ambition. The revolution also shaped how Americans understood time and progress. The break with Britain was seen as a founding moment, a new beginning that set history on a different course. This sense of novelty encouraged optimism and experimentation. It also created pressure to live up to founding ideals, to measure present actions against the memory of revolutionary sacrifice. Failure to do so could be framed as betrayal. Education became a central concern in this context. A self-governing people, many believed, required knowledge, virtue, and civic responsibility. Schools, academies, and colleges expanded, promoting the idea that citizenship was a skill to be cultivated. This emphasis reflected the revolution's belief that liberty depended not only on institutions, but on the character of the people. The language of the revolution continued to evolve. Terms like liberty, rights, and sovereignty took on new meanings as they were applied to changing circumstances. Different groups claimed these concepts for their own purposes. Workers invoked them in economic disputes. Reformers used them to challenge inequality. Politicians wielded them in struggles for power. The revolution provided a shared reference point, even as interpretations diverged. In this way, the American Revolution functioned less as a completed event and more as a continuing argument. Each generation revisited its principles, reinterpreted its legacy, and tested its boundaries. The absence of a final resolution was not a failure, but a defining feature. The revolution had opened a space for contestation that could not easily be closed. By 1789, the formal structures of the new nation were in place. A government had been established, authority transferred, and independence secured. Yet the deeper transformation was ongoing. Americans were still learning how to be a people who ruled themselves. The habits, assumptions, and conflicts forged during the Revolutionary era would shape their future in ways both anticipated and unforeseen. The American Revolution thus stands as a turning point not because it ended struggle, but because it redefined its terms. Power would no longer be accepted as inherited or unquestionable. It would be debated, resisted, and reshaped. From protest to empire, the path traced between 1763 and 1789 marked the birth of a nation and the beginning of a long, unfinished journey. The unfinished nature of the revolution became most apparent in how Americans talked about their future. Independence had been won through collective action, but the meaning of that victory was open to interpretation. Some believed the revolution's purpose had been fulfilled once British rule ended and a constitutional system was established. Others saw independence as only the first step in a broader transformation that would unfold over generations. This tension shaped political debates, social movements, and national ambitions. The idea of popular sovereignty, once a radical assertion, gradually became a defining assumption. Even those who feared excessive democracy acknowledged that authority ultimately rested with the people. Elections became routine, though fiercely contested. Losing power no longer meant exile or execution, but political opposition. This shift represented a profound departure from the norms of the 18th century world. Peaceful transfer of authority, while imperfect, became a revolutionary inheritance. Yet the revolution's commitment to consent existed alongside persistent exclusions. Indigenous peoples were rarely considered part of the political community imagined by revolutionary leaders. Treaties were made and broken as expansion advanced. The language of civilization and progress replaced earlier imperial justifications, but the outcome was similar. The new nation asserted control over land and peoples, extending its reach while denying full participation to those it displaced. Women's relationship to the revolution followed a parallel pattern. Revolutionary rhetoric elevated the importance of virtue, sacrifice, and civic responsibility, qualities often associated with women's roles in family and community life. While these ideas acknowledged women's contributions, they stopped short of political equality. The revolution reshaped expectations without dismantling patriarchal structures. Change occurred in attitudes and opportunities, but formal power remained elusive. Slavery remained the most profound contradiction. The revolution disrupted the institution in some regions and hardened it in others. Enslaved people sought freedom through flight, negotiation, and service in the war, forcing the issue into public view. Some achieved liberation. Others were sold further south as the institution adapted to new economic realities. The revolution exposed slavery's incompatibility with its ideals, but it lacked the resolve to resolve that conflict. These unresolved issues did not diminish the revolution's significance. Rather, they defined its legacy. By articulating universal principles without fully applying them, the revolution created standards by which future generations would judge their society. Those excluded from the original vision could claim the revolution's language as their own, using it to demand inclusion and reform. Internationally, the success of the American experiment challenged assumptions about stability and authority. Monarchies could be resisted, empires could be broken, written constitutions could replace inherited rule. These ideas circulated widely, inspiring admiration and fear. Some rulers attempted reform to prevent similar uprisings. Others tightened control. The revolution's influence was uneven, but undeniable. The transformation from colonies to nation also altered Americans' sense of history. The past was no longer defined by connection to Britain, but by a shared revolutionary experience. Founding moments acquired symbolic power. Anniversaries were celebrated. Documents were preserved and revered. This historical consciousness reinforced national identity while shaping political legitimacy. Over time, the revolution's memory became a tool. Leaders invoked it to justify policies. Opponents cited it to challenge authority. Competing interpretations coexisted, each claiming fidelity to revolutionary principles. This flexibility made the revolution enduringly relevant. It was not frozen in the past, but continually reimagined in the present. The period between 1763 and 1789 thus represents both rupture and continuity. Old loyalties were broken, new institutions created, and political imagination expanded. At the same time, social hierarchies, economic interests, and cultural assumptions persisted. The revolution altered the framework within which power operated, even as it preserved many of the structures that shaped daily life. From the vantage point of history, the American Revolution appears neither inevitable nor complete. It was contingent, shaped by choices, chance, and conflict. Its outcome depended on fragile alliances, uncertain leadership, and popular endurance. That it succeeded at all remains remarkable. That it left so much unresolved is part of its enduring power. The revolution's greatest achievement may lie in what it made possible rather than what it finished. By asserting that authority could be challenged and reconstituted, it opened space for future struggles over justice, equality, and power. The nation that emerged was not the fulfillment of a promise, but the beginning of a long argument about what freedom requires. The story that began with imperial reform and colonial protest ended with the creation of a republic, unlike any the world had seen. Yet the forces unleashed between 1763 and 1789 continued to shape the American experience. The revolution did not simply replace one ruler with another. It transformed how power was understood, contested, and justified, leaving a legacy that would echo far beyond its own time. By the time the new constitutional system took effect, Americans had already internalized a lesson that would define their political culture for generations. Conflict was not a sign of failure, but an expected condition of self-government. The revolution had not produced unanimity. It had produced a framework within which disagreement could exist without destroying the whole. This understanding distinguished the new nation from the empires it had rejected, where dissent was often equated with disloyalty. The habits formed during the revolutionary era continued to shape leadership itself. Authority was exercised cautiously, conscious of public suspicion. Even those in power framed their actions as temporary stewardship rather than permanent rule. This posture reflected both genuine belief and political necessity. Leaders knew that legitimacy depended on restraint, transparency, and appeals to shared principles rooted in the revolutionary experience. At the same time, Americans grew more comfortable with the idea of national power. Independence required coordination, defense, and economic stability. Over time, resistance to centralized authority softened when it appeared to serve collective interests. This gradual acceptance did not erase fear of tyranny, but it demonstrated the revolution's flexibility. Principles were not abandoned, they were adapted. The transformation from colonies to nation also altered Americans' expectations of opportunity. Independence encouraged movement, ambition, and risk-taking. The absence of hereditary rank and the availability of land created the impression of a society defined by mobility rather than fixed status. While this image often obscured persistent inequalities, it shaped how Americans understood themselves and their future. The revolution's language became inseparable from American identity. Words forged in opposition to empire were woven into everyday political life. Appeals to liberty, rights, and the people became standard features of public discourse. These terms carried moral weight, even when applied inconsistently. They constrained power by forcing leaders to justify actions within a shared ethical framework. Over time, the revolution came to represent more than a historical event. It became a moral reference point, a measure against which actions were judged. Political movements would repeatedly return to its principles, claiming continuity with its spirit even as circumstances changed. This process kept the revolution alive, not as a static memory, but as an active influence. The international position of the United States also reflected its revolutionary origins. Suspicion of empire coexisted with confidence in national destiny. The nation sought recognition as an equal among powers while insisting on independence from their control. This balance was difficult to maintain and often strained by external pressures. Yet it reflected the revolution's dual legacy of caution and ambition. The years after independence confirmed that revolutions do not end neatly. They reshape institutions, identities, and expectations in ways that unfold over time. The American Revolution dismantled imperial authority, but it also transferred responsibility. Americans could no longer attribute injustice or failure to distant rulers. The burden of self-government rested on their own decisions. This shift carried profound psychological consequences. Self-rule demanded vigilance, compromise, and patience. It required accepting uncertainty and imperfection. The revolution had promised liberty, not ease. Its legacy was not comfort, but agency. From the vantage point of later generations, the revolution's achievements and limitations became clearer. It had expanded the boundaries of political possibility while leaving unresolved conflicts that would demand further struggle. It had created a nation capable of self-correction, but not immune to injustice. Its ideals inspired both genuine reform and self-serving rhetoric. The period from 1763 to 1789 thus stands as a foundational transformation. It marked the collapse of colonial dependence and the birth of a republic grounded in contested principles. The journey from protest to independence to nationhood revealed the complexity of revolution itself. Change emerged not from a single moment, but from sustained pressure, debate, and adaptation. The American Revolution did not simply reject empire. It absorbed some of its structures, reworked others, and reimagined authority altogether. In doing so, it created a political culture defined by argument rather than obedience. That culture would shape the nation's trajectory long after the generation of revolutionaries had passed from the scene. The American Revolution ultimately stands as a transformation in how power was understood, justified, and limited. What began in 1763 as a dispute over imperial policy ended in 1789 with the establishment of a new political order that rejected inherited authority and asserted the right of a people to govern themselves. This transformation was neither clean nor complete. It unfolded through uncertainty, contradiction, and compromise, leaving behind a nation defined as much by its unresolved tensions as by its achievements. The path from protest to independence revealed the fragility of empire. British leaders believed they were strengthening imperial control through reform, but they underestimated the political maturity that had developed in the colonies. Colonists did not see themselves as subjects to be managed, but as participants in a constitutional tradition that protected their rights. When those rights appeared threatened, resistance followed. What Britain viewed as reasonable governance, Americans increasingly viewed as illegitimate power. The revolution was driven as much by ideas as by events. Political thought shaped how colonists interpreted taxes, laws, and military presence. The belief that liberty depended on consent transformed administrative disputes into moral crises. Once that belief took hold, compromise became increasingly difficult. Authority without representation was no longer a technical problem. It was a violation of principle. Yet the revolution was not fueled by ideology alone. It was sustained by organization, sacrifice, and endurance. Militias, assemblies, committees, and armies translated abstract ideals into collective action. Ordinary people bore the costs of resistance through boycotts, shortages, violence, and loss. Their participation gave the revolution its force and legitimacy, even as leadership remained largely in elite hands. Foreign intervention underscored the revolution's global significance. Independence was not achieved in isolation. It depended on rivalries between empires and the willingness of other powers to challenge British dominance. The revolution thus became part of a wider struggle over global power, even as it claimed to reject imperial ambition. This paradox would shape the nation's future. The achievement of independence forced Americans to confront a new challenge. Removing imperial authority was easier than replacing it with a stable alternative. The early weakness of national institutions reflected revolutionary fears, but it also revealed the limits of decentralization. The eventual creation of a stronger framework marked a shift from resistance to governance, from unity against an external threat to negotiation among internal interests. That transition defined the revolution's final phase. The creation of a constitutional system did not end debate. It institutionalized it. Disagreement became a permanent feature rather than a temporary crisis. The revolution thus reshaped not only political structures but political expectations. Conflict was no longer a sign of disloyalty. It was evidence of participation. The revolution's contradictions remained central to its meaning. Liberty coexisted with slavery. Equality was proclaimed amid exclusion. Expansion promised opportunity while producing dispossession. These contradictions were not accidental. They were the result of choices made to preserve unity and stability at critical moments. Their consequences would shape future struggles. What makes the American Revolution enduring is not its perfection, but its openness. It established principles that could be invoked, challenged, and expanded over time. It created a nation that defined itself not by obedience to authority, but by argument over its limits. This legacy made reform possible, even when progress was slow and contested. From the distance of history, the revolution appears less like a single event and more like a reorientation. Power shifted from empire to people, from tradition to consent, from inheritance to choice. That shift was incomplete and uneven, but it altered the trajectory of political life. The years between 1763 and 1789 marked the birth of a republic and the emergence of a new political imagination. The American Revolution did not resolve the question of how liberty and power should coexist. It made that question unavoidable. In doing so, it ensured that the struggle begun in resistance would continue within the institutions it created. This is the revolution's lasting legacy. Not the end of conflict, but the beginning of self-rule. Not the absence of power, but its accountability. From protest to empire, from colony to nation, the American Revolution transformed the meaning of authority and left behind a challenge that each generation would inherit anew.